fear is the mind killer.
Alongside Enemy in 2013, Denis Villeneuve released another fantastic project with his thriller film Prisoners, starring Hugh Jackman and Jake Gyllenhaal. Out of all the films on Denis' filmography, Prisoners is my personal favourite, and one of the main reasons why is because the filmmaker proved he could tell a story through a narrative maze that connects to so many different elements on display. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my thoughts on Prisoners, exploring how Denis Villeneuve creates a perfect film through symbolism in the story and characters. This video essay continues my Road to Dune series, where I create content on all of the Dune adaptations, Frank Herbert's original novel, Denis Villeneuve's filmography, and his upcoming 2021 film. During the build-up, I will also be covering any news and information surrounding the director's latest project. To stay up to date with all of these videos, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. Also, feel free to check me out on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Instagram at Cortex Videos, which is all linked in the description below. But without further ado, let's dive into Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners. So while the main story of Prisoners is about the kidnapping of two young girls, the movie as a whole is an examination of the kinds of prisons people find themselves in, physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. Mazes end up being a bigger deal, and the whole concept of a maze is that people become lost in the complications of that structure. Prisoners puts this concept to use by showing how people struggle to work through and escape from their traumas. Whether that's the death of a child, the loss of faith, murdering a murderer, having your child abducted, or even torturing someone you know is guilty but they won't confess. But the idea of the maze goes beyond the characters to even the structure of the story. Prisoners could have presented information typically by giving details in a chronological way that's easy to understand. Instead, it purposely scatters important details throughout the story without chronological context, meaning that it's easy to forget them or not connect them the way we should. This is done in order to have Prisoners become a narrative maze. The simple progress of the story is an artistic choice to create the sense of something you can't quite solve and that there's more going on than you may have realised. Denis and his team accomplished this by placing key backstory and exposition details throughout the film without having a single scene that clearly ties them all together. This means that it's on the viewer to complete the few missing pieces of the whole puzzle. And there are two more elements that make Prisoners an even deeper kind of cinematic project. One is thematic, and the other is how the story is constructed. Thematically, beyond mazes are huge motifs. The main villain is in a war against the Christian god, while the hero is named after a god of Norse mythology. There are characters named Grace and Joy, and many times throughout the film, there's an emphasis on trees. Is it a coincidence that Joy's last name is Birch, which is also a very common tree in America? Denis is essentially saying something on the collision between civilization and nature, Christianity and the old gods. And then we come to the construction of the story. The last shot of the movie is Jake Gyllenhaal's detective Loki hearing a faint whistle. We know it's coming from Hugh Jackman's Keller Dover, trapped underground, but unfortunately, Loki doesn't know this. There's this tension as Loki hears the whistle but dismisses it, hears it again, over and over, and before we see him decide to investigate or leave, the movie ends. We're ultimately left on the question of, does Loki save Keller or not? Maybe the most impressive thing to me about Prisoners is that almost everything that happens in the movie is a clue for Loki. The question is, will he put it all together and solve the puzzle? Which really is a question for us as the viewer. Have we been paying attention to all the clues that point to whether Loki will or won't find Keller? It's interesting, but it perfectly summarises the complete construction and point of this story. And this can all relate back to the title of the movie. The title is of course simple, but the simplicity can disarm you. At first, we might think that it applies to the abduction of Joy and Anna. They're prisoners, but then midway through the movie, Keller kidnaps Paul Dano's Alex Jones and keeps him as a prisoner in grueling fashion. And what do you know, at the end of the movie, Keller's imprisoned by Alex's aunt Holly. As a viewer, you might think that's the end of it, but the more you dig into Prisoners, it eventually becomes clear as day that the entire movie is this layered exploration of various types of prisons, being physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. Beyond that, the story plays out in such a way that it intentionally leaves viewers to put together key details. Compare this to other crime thrillers, and most of those movies do the traditional thing of stacking information so that as the plot progresses, we feel more knowledgeable and empowered about what's going on. You start the movie in a place of ignorance, but end with a sense of superiority in understanding nearly every aspect. But Prisoners doesn't neatly stack its information. Instead, it gives you a pile of puzzle pieces, and if you want to get the full picture, you have to unite all of these elements. In a way, the movie itself becomes a bit of a prison, a kind of artistic piece that we lose ourselves in. And all of this is of course on purpose, as midway through the film, the motif of the maze is introduced. At first, the maze might seem like nothing more than the ravings of a lunatic, put into the script to add to the mystery and tension of the film. But like the title, things aren't always so simple. Bob Taylor's house has mazes drawn on the walls, and when he's taken into police custody, the police demand to know exactly where the abducted girls are, with him in turn spending 3 hours drawing a maze to show them. The dead body discovered in the priest's house just so happens to have a maze necklace on. There's an FBI book about a serial abductor who was obsessed with mazes. And the imprisoned Alex Jones eventually tells his captor that the girls are in the maze. Now, while this does play into the drama and mystery of a crime thriller, when you look at the structure of Prisoners and how it tells its story and reveals information, there's an understanding that the maze stuff wasn't just to escalate the thriller aspects. It serves a meta purpose to make us aware of how to watch and understand the movie. And while this technique is more common in artistic projects, like we said before, it connects to everything surrounding the idea of imprisonment. It reinforces the theme because a maze can be, after all, a prison, and almost every character in Prisoners is working through some kind of maze. But again, it's also a clue from the filmmaker to treat the movie as a maze. We have the display of physical imprisonment. Holly keeps the 2 girls and eventually keeps Keller in captivity. Keller also takes Alex captive. The priest traps Mr. Jones in the basement to die, and Loki literally arrests people with the intent of sending them to prison. Then we have emotional imprisonment. The disappearance of Anna and Joy emotionally devastates the Dover and Birch families, and Grace, Anna's mother, goes from sad denial of reality to drugging herself into oblivion. Franklin, Joy's dad, objects to Keller's treatment of Alex, but participates for a time because he feels he has no other option if he wants to get his daughter back. There's also psychological imprisonment. Alex and Bob Taylor both suffer from the trauma of their kidnapping, and there's a contrast to how their trauma expresses itself. Alex has headed towards introversion. We, the audience, struggle to understand what's going through Alex's mind, and compared to Bob, he almost completely externalized his pain. He draws mazes on walls, imitates kidnapping children, and yet he's equally difficult to understand. And finally, there's spiritual imprisonment. Holly and her husband found it impossible to move beyond their belief that God had wronged them, and because of that, they've tortured other families to cause a similar crisis of faith and turned more people against God. And Grace's character is the embodiment of the spiritual crisis the Jonases hope to enact. So with these motifs in mind, we can finally get to what I think is the most interesting thing about Prisoners. The story, the characters, and the filmmaking is great, but how the movie explores religion and puts Christianity in conversation with other religions and spiritualities is pretty incredible. Prisoners is about spirituality and the complicated nature we all have with it. How do we make sense of the bad that happens in the world? How do we have faith in the arising of bad events? And how do we make sense of the miracles in our lives? The big issue every character has is with acceptance. Accepting not just the bad but the good as well. Holly and her husband could have found comfort in one another, and instead, their crusade ends up resulting in both of their deaths. Bob Taylor survived his abduction, but can't move beyond the trauma of it. Grace completely falls apart in the wake of Anna's disappearance, to the point of not functioning. People can't accept freedom, they can't accept loss, and it's really just Loki and Keller who keep their faith. Keller in his belief that Alex Jones knows where the girls are, and Loki in his own inclinations and deductions. They accept what their instincts tell them, and both end up playing the hero. Keller's faith in preparation creates a chain of events that causes his daughter to leave a whistle in the hole in Holly's yard, and it's that particular whistle that he uses to signal Loki at the end of the movie. And while Loki's faith in following signs guides him right to the imprisoned Keller, the fact that our two most faithful characters end the movie together, each trusting in their faith, is actually pretty impressive. But saying this, as the movie ends right before Loki saves Keller, the sense of catharsis is something Prisoners denies us, which is, all in all, pretty fitting to the idea of the movie. By not showing Keller's rescue, we're left with a choice. Do we have faith in Loki or don't we? What ending do we personally choose? And what fate for Keller do we actually accept? By leaving that choice in our hands and open, the film becomes a moment of reflection, of confrontation, and it perfectly asks you what you believe in. But that was my video essay on Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners and how the director gave us a narrative maze of perfection. I'm especially intrigued to see how the filmmaker will choose to tackle the narrative in Dune, and with the story being incredibly dense and full of detail, it will definitely be a hard job to pull off. But this is something that Denis has proved he can tackle from different directions with varying projects in the past, so it's very likely that we are in store for another fantastic adaptation from the director. But let me know down below what you personally thought towards Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners, alongside what you find interesting about his 2013 film. My next video in this Road to Dune marathon continues with Denis Villeneuve's Sicario, where I will be going deeper into how the director displayed moral ambiguity through an unbiased lens on the drug war. This will be released in the next week, alongside much more content on Dune 2021 coming over the next few months. To stay up to date with this series, along with all the latest news on Denis Villeneuve's Dune, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like rating and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.